Welcome back to the Rum Ration, where we toast military history one tot of rum at a time, sometimes two, especially this weekend, because here in Canada, it's Thanksgiving weekend. So to all our Canadian listeners, we wish you a very, very happy Thanksgiving from the Rum Ration podcast, indeed. So I'm Rejoy, and my co-host Colin has arranged for a special guest to join us today. Now, if you're watching this episode on YouTube, you may detect a hint of fraternal resemblance between our guest and one of our co-hosts. In fact, not fraternal, but there is a resemblance with all of us.
I think we could probably take our hats off and
Yes,
break the fourth wall for a second.
It's the rakish hairstyle. So
it's the bald and the beautiful. We made reference to that before. I think that's the way.
Yeah, it's very.
So we're gonna go with stunning good looks.
Stunning good looks.
Stunning good looks. I'll take that.
Yeah. So today on episode 26, we are diving. Literally, we've got lots of diving and submarine kind of puns.
Saw what you did with that, yes.
Into the secret birth of Canada's submarine service.
Indeed. It's a story of panic on the Pacific coast, a provincial premier with nerves of steel, and we're not talking about Doug Ford, and two mysterious boats that slipped out of Seattle under the cover of night.
And who better to tell it than Canada's senior submariner himself, Rear-Admiral Christopher Robinson. So strap in. This one's submerged in intrigue.
Feel free to use Colin's wonderful literary talents there when you're reposting this episode.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Our guest today, of course, needs no introduction in Canada's naval circles, but we're going to give him a proper one anyway, because that's what we do here at the Rum Ration podcast. We don't follow rules. Rear-Admiral Christopher Robinson grew up in Hudson, Quebec. He actually started his military career in the Army Reserve as a combat engineer in Westmount, just down the street from the RMR, before finding his true calling beneath the waves, joining the regular force as a naval warfare officer. Since then, he's logged more than 1,500 days at sea, including command of HMCS Corner Brook and later the Canadian Submarine Force itself, as well as Canadian Fleet Atlantic. Most recently, he commanded Maritime Forces Pacific and Joint Task Force Pacific, where he also served as deputy commander for the massive multinational RIMPAC 2022 exercise. Now, RIMPAC are the largest naval maneuvers in the world, with more than 20 countries participating. Ashore, he's been equally busy, serving in senior leadership roles at Naval Headquarters, from Director of Naval Requirements to Director General Naval Force Development. And as of this year, he's taken on one of the biggest jobs in the CAF, Deputy Vice Chief of the Defense Staff. And Admiral Robinson is currently seconded to serve as the Chief Military Advisor to the brand spanking new Defense Investment Agency that our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, announced a couple of weeks ago. He's a graduate of submarine command courses from Norway, the United States, and Australia, dare I say the holy trinity of undersea warfare schools. And he's rounded that out with studies at the Harvard Kennedy School, the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and the Royal Military College of Canada. Off duty, he's a husband to an Army reservist, father of 3 sons and a daughter-in-law, an outdoors enthusiast, biker, both kinds, and a proud scouting leader. He's also alleged, DNA test results are pending, to be related to my co-host. Admiral Robinson, it is absolutely a true pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure. As one of the early fans, possibly maybe even viewer 1 or 2 or a couple hundred for sure.
Mom might have beat you, but probably not. It took her a while to figure out how to click on YouTube.
Well, my mom didn't even bother, so there you go. So let's set the scene.
Should we go that a little further, Rejoy? Or
No. Chris, we've gone over this several times in previous episodes. We're not going into Rejoy's mommy issues on this episode. No, it just takes too long.
My therapist says I should talk about it at every instance possible. But so we're going to go back in time to the summer of 1914. So, Admiral, tell us, what was happening on Canada's west coast that made British Columbians so anxious about German raiders?
Well, I think it's important to remember the context of where we were in 1914. And World War I, which we, of course, have the benefit of hindsight of realizing ended up being this massive conflagration. At the time, it was a slow-motion car crash as we sort of stumbled away towards it. There was a whole network of treaties and stuff. Everyone knew that they were going to end up at war. And it allowed for sort of speculation and sort of a feverish anticipation to develop, right? And that played out in a number of ways. Everything from the mass enrollments of people who thought they'd be home by Christmas, and this was a great chance to go see Europe on the king's dime, through to building up the hype of what the foe looked like. So Imperial Germany had a squadron of modern cruisers in the Pacific. And the thing about ships is that they can be in one place one day and another place the other day fairly easily. And they were strongly rumored to be off the west coast of North America. Depending on which report, and none of them were probably based in a lot of fact. They were off Chile, they were off Mexico, they were off the US, like we don't know, but they're super close to Vancouver and Victoria. And that led to a certain apprehension. And for your listeners who've been to the West Coast and seen Victoria and Vancouver, they both sit right on the water. Victoria in particular, you can just steam up the Strait of Juan de Fuca, lob a couple of shells into it, and be gone before anyone has really noticed. So there was a significant amount of concern, particularly amongst the residents of Victoria and Vancouver. Victoria being the seat of government, so that kind of concern resonated more strongly. So take that building concern, that knowledge that a war is about to break out, and add to that politicians who are very close to the ground at the time. They're much smaller populations back then. They met with people. Throw in a gentleman's club, I guess is what it would be called back then. A club for fairly wealthy people, private club, I guess, called the Union Club in downtown Victoria. And add a shipyard president who had a couple of unsold submarines. So you have this building concern that were undefended. The Royal Navy really were pretty much the original colonizers, settlers of Victoria. They had pulled out several years earlier. The Royal Canadian Navy was created in 1910. There was a decrepit by the times standard old cruiser in Esquimalt, but it was like many secondhand defense purchases. It was the best of what was available, and not necessarily the best of what would have been desired, I guess. So you had this old cruiser. Rainbow was the same HMC's Rainbow, and not much else. The Royal Navy had pulled out several years earlier. There was a couple of guns and shore batteries, but there wasn't much defense. So there was a desire to do more. This meeting happened in the Union Club between Premier McBride and Mr. Patterson, the CEO or the president of Seattle Shipyards. And they concocted a plan to buy these two submarines. And the submarines had been built for the Chilean government. And they had paid a portion of them, like a large portion of the purchase cost, and had, for whatever reason, decided that they didn't want to take delivery, and they were sort of stretching it out and asking for a bunch of changes. The Seattle shipyard claimed that the Chileans had requested certain changes in construction, which had made the boats heavy, which provided an awkward characteristic that when the submarine was underwater, it would occasionally point straight towards the bottom or straight towards the surface, whichever, unexpectedly. And this was
that sounds exciting.
Alarming, I guess.
alarming, yes.
So anyway, they hadn't paid for them. And from the shipyard was building these boats under license for a company called Electric Boat out east in Groton, Connecticut. So they were kind of stuck. They couldn't pay their subcontractors. They couldn't get the final payment from the Chileans, and they didn't know what to do with the boats. And World War I was coming. It was clear at the time that the U.S. would not be involved in World War I. There was a very strong isolationist sentiment, which would mean that there would be an arms embargo. So there was a strong desire to get this purchase done before that embargo took place. So World War I kicked off on the 4th of August. And probably one of the very first documents that was drafted up was this statement of neutrality for the U.S., which was known or certainly believed to be signed on the 5th, so the next morning. So there was a strong desire. So Premier McBride and the naval staff in Esquimalt had cabled a telegram, I guess, precursor to email, to Ottawa saying, "Hey, we got this great deal for the low price you wouldn't believe. We'd like to buy these submarines." But defense procurement, and I know you've covered procurement earlier, it is slow and laborious, and there are a number of checks and balances. So they didn't have a reply. And Mr. Patterson was a fairly convincing salesperson and managed to keep the pressure on. And like, you really need to buy them now. And oh, by the way, it has to be cash because
Ah,
Cash is king.
sounds legit. Sounds legit.
So Premier McBride, possibly sensing an opportunity, but certainly exercising a bit of leadership. There could have had, the province of British Columbia could have been stuck with this. And $1.1 million in 1914 dollars, according to the Bank of Canada inflation calculator, about 35 million Canadian today, which I suppose where you your perspective on things is either a lot or not a lot. In terms of buying submarines, I would say that's a steal, and that is 1/1000th of the cost of a submarine today. But at the time, it was a lot of money for a small province. And he had them issue a check. So they once the Sail Shipyard knew that the submarines were going to be sold, they arranged for them to sail out under battery power, so to be as quiet as possible, because the Americans were already wise to the fact that there would be last minute exports trying to, kind of like tariffs, right, where everyone tried to get all their supplies in before the tariffs took. Same thing when you declare neutrality. So they sort of snuck out under the cover of darkness, literally in the middle of the night, shot across the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and were met about 5 miles south of Trail Island, which is an island to the southeast of Victoria, within sight of downtown Victoria. Anyway, at about 4:45 in the morning, the deal was done. The inspection had completed. While they were preparing for it, they had sort of scrounged the West Coast for anyone who could spell submarine. And at that point, submarine.
But I would have discounted both rejoin I.
Yes. Yeah, it was a really neat weapon of war, right? Like, it had only existed plus or minus in a real way for 14 or 15 years. The Brits had brought their first boat into service, I think 1901 or 1900, anyway, very, very recently. So to find people who not only had submarine experience, but had emigrated to the west coast of Canada, limited your pool somewhat. But they found some. And so that person and the superintendent, the senior engineer from Esquimalt Shipyard, Esquimalt Dockyard, sorry, the naval dockyard in Esquimalt, went over, inspected the boats with the big presento check, I suppose. Through the boats and said, "Hey, good to go." Handed the check over, to the left, and the boats made their way into Esquimalt. Because this had happened so unexpectedly fast, right? There are stories that the defense teams weren't ready for them, and the guns were minutes away from firing on them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, it worked out great. They hoisted a tablecloth, apparently, to show that they were neutral or not a threat, and in they were coming. There were no German U-boats in the Pacific at that point, but of course, a artillery person crewing one of these shore defense guns would not have known that, I suppose.
Yes,
because submarines back in 1914, they were very fragile craft compared to what they are today. They weren't designed to do transatlantic voyages, certainly not trans-Pacific voyages. They weren't self-sustained. They were very limited in their ability to go forth. Of course, within a couple of years of the war and the war on commerce that the Imperial German Navy sort of launched on, that improved, and they pushed those little types of submarines way further than they had any right to. But yeah, no, it was a kind of a touch and go. But what I think is most impressive, and having spent my career in submarines and sailed on a number of different classes, and I transitioned from the Oberon class, so a type of British-built submarine, to the Upholder class, a different type of British-built submarine, one generation newer, but effectively the same. And when I went over for the training on that, it was 2 years. We spent 6 months in classroom learning the differences and capabilities. We spent another 4 or 5 months doing walkthroughs and being tested and all that kind of stuff. And then we did a year of collective training teams on how to operate these things. for people, and the vast majority of the crews of these two boats had never even seen a submarine, to receive that into service, to arm it, and to have it on patrol within a couple of weeks is phenomenal. I just can't imagine how that was done. It certainly couldn't be done today. Um, it's important to note that the boats, there were CC1 and 2 is how they ended up being called. C, because they roughly resemble the British C-class submarines. The second C, you can imagine why, for my first initial.
Colin.
Colin. Colin and Chris, the boats.
Not
and then 1
retouched.
and 2.
No.
1 and 2.
Good see Chatterjee.
So they arrived without torpedoes. They didn't have deck. One of them had an alarming tendency to go way deep when it was dived, partially because it took water into the submarine, which the rule number 1 of the submarine enterprise is you keep water out of the people tank. But it had CC2 had a tendency to bring water into the people tank, which was awkward. So they got one. They fixed the ballast bombs. They found this valve that it wasn't seating properly and letting water in. There was some minor debate about whether the boat had ever touched the bottom or not. There was clearly marks that it had touched the bottom, but the lieutenant in charge had said, "Well, it was just a touch and go, like nothing to see here, move along." But anyway, they fixed it, and they had the boats sort of sorted out. They were able to dive them, get them on patrol. They tried to get a couple of torpedoes. They had 18-inch torpedo tubes, and back in 1914, torpedo tubes weren't standardized like they are today. Like a Western submarine, plus or minus, is going to have the same diameter torpedo and roughly the same length of torpedo. Not that they're super interchangeable, but they're interchangeable enough. They didn't have any submarine torpedoes on the West Coast. So they tried to get a couple.
You couldn't just go down to Torpedoes R Us and pick up
Well,
a
they
couple?
tried, right? But Canada Post was on strike even back then.
Right. Yeah. Typical.
So, of course, I support our union brethren.
Oh, no, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
So they tried to grab a couple of torpedoes that the Electric Boat Company had on loan on the West Coast for trials and stuff like that. And they actually managed to get them. And it's not clear to me how they got these torpedoes out. I mean, they're 18-inch diameter. They're probably 15 feet long, plus or minus. They're not small and they're not light, but they got them out.
Hard to tuck underneath your shirt and just kind of stroll out.
So even hard to put in like a sailboat or something and just kind of sneak it out. Anyway, I haven't been able to find how they got them out, but they did get them out. And they got them over to Esquimalt, and they discovered that the shipyard had been one step ahead of them and had removed the gyro compasses. And the gyro compasses, of course, what makes a torpedo run straight. Without that, it's slightly less useful. So they had to order them from Halifax, which is a long way away, 4 times away, and they get put on a train and sent out and arrived. And so, if your listeners are keeping up, we got the boats on the morning of the 5th of August. They had that ballast valve issue fixed. They had torpedoes brought out from Halifax. They trained a crew, of which none had ever been on a submarine before, save one captain, and had them on patrol by mid-September, which
That's
I
unbelievable.
think is
incredible.
phenomenal. And
that's incredible. I mean, similar things are happening on the Army side too. When you think of the mass mobilization, creation of a base, 30,000 soldiers equipped, you can argue and quibble about the quality of the equipment and the training, but they were trained and equipped and put on ships and sent over to the UK. And here you go in the Navy doing something absolutely. I mean, you blew my mind this summer when you and I were on that canoe trip, and you were telling me this. You just kind of like casually mentioned it, like as if it was common knowledge that that's how we got into submarines, and it absolutely blew my mind. And I guess because Canada celebrated 100 years of submarines back in 2014, but I guess really it was almost by accident. It wasn't like a planned. Is it fair to say that we weren't planning to get into submarine business? It was more that BC Premier McBride brought us into the submarines.
It entirely is that. So the Canadian Navy has its history in the fisheries services and protecting Canadian fishes. And indeed, when the Navy was first stood up, kind of the unofficial motto was to keep our fish on our side of the line and the American out, right? There was a lot of conflict with the United States of America, particularly in the Grand Banks in that area there, where
Oh, yes.
Sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
meeting demands. But there was larger appetite to create a navy, depending on who you were. So if you were on the Navy side, of course, you wanted a multi-purpose,
Naturally.
capable.
Yeah.
Bigger, better.
Yep.
Absolutely. And if you were on the government, particularly in the Ministry of Finance side, you wanted a small and economical navy.
Hey, how about a canoe?
Precisely.
We can fit it with a crossbow in the.
So the government had struck upon this idea that you'd just buy used boats that were barely used, so the depreciation, they're off the lot. The depreciation's already taken place, so they're really cheap. So we tried that a couple of times and it hadn't worked out super great. So in 1910, when the Navy finally was created, and even leading up to the creation of the Navy, and for the first year or two, there was a debate, a live sort of Canadian political debate about whether it was better to have our own Navy or it was better to pay the Royal Navy, the British Navy, to protect us. And depending, it was a partisan divide, and one party was pro National Navy and the other was pro paying the UK Navy. And it kind of made it difficult to create a balanced fleet. So to start things off, in 1910, we received two old cruisers, and there's a theme here. They weren't the same. Cruiser Rainbow and Niobe were not the same. And they were varying, degrees of capability. The larger one went to Halifax. That was Niobe. And the smaller one, and not a lot smaller, but significantly enough smaller one, went on the further cruise all the way around to the west coast. And the idea there was the threat was in the Atlantic, and clearly, even in 1910, we didn't know we were going to end up in World War One, but certainly there was enough intrigue, and the naval arms race was ongoing, and all that kind of stuff. And Europe was heading towards not a good place, and that would impact Canada primarily on the east coast, and the west coast was sort of safe and secure. So Niobe had gone into Halifax, Rainbow had gone around to the west coast. They had spent a couple of years in service, and these were ships that were what we could afford at the time. So they were at the end of their serviceable life.
Ooh,
They really
sounds familiar.
Yeah. The maintenance wasn't great on them. And back before radars were invented, when you used to sail at night or in fog, you operated pretty much on a touch principle, right? You went slowly until you touched something that was too shallow. You go, ooh. Then you listen for sound signals of other ships doing the same thing. So Niobe had actually gone aground off of Halifax, and had been barely saved. Not saved as in she almost sank, but it saved it. It's expensive to fix it, and we're not sure we want to do this. And on the West Coast, Rainbow wasn't in a significantly better shape. So the Navy was struggling, and we didn't have an idea. And I say we, clearly, I was a very young officer back then, but we didn't have a sense of how the war was going to play out with Germany. And I don't think anyone had expected that it was going to be a commerce war. By commerce war, I mean submarines sinking commercial ships. In fact, because submarines were only 14, 15 years old, the expectation that they would do that kind of stuff was considered to be acting like pirates. And there was the British second Sea Lord, a very famous officer, who said something to the effect of that it was underhanded, un-English, and they should be hanged as pirates. So when the first British submarine went out and sank a bunch of German warships, they came back flying the Jolly Roger, and in there, the Jolly Roger became the symbol. But so where am I going with this long and fairly nonsensical detour here? Fleet planning wasn't super strong. We didn't really know what naval war was going to look like. There was a lot of memories of Trafalgar and Vice Admiral Nelson and all that kind of stuff, which for those that are keeping track, was done 110 years earlier. So the evolution had come a fairly long way. So the intent, to sum up, was sort of smaller ships, cruiser-sized ships, and a cruiser didn't refer back then so much as to a large air defense warship like it does today. It was more a ship that was capable of going on independent patrols, sort of a global reach,
Mhm.
and was really used either to screen the fleet being the battleships, the big, actual valuable capital ships, or to be on patrol in the sort of far-flung reaches of the Empire, um, fighting other equally less capable ships. So that was what Rainbow and Niagara were intended to do. And probably the intent was we would just, build a couple of new ones and it would all be good. Because there is a recurring belief in many countries that ships are easy to build. Like, how hard can it be, right? Like,
Right.
we've been building dugout canoes for thousands of years. So, like, can we not just slap some steel together, put an engine in, and maybe a gun or two? And it's good. We built fish.
Makes sense. I think Rejoy and I are planning on starting the Rum Ration steel ship company
I would recommend
next
it.
week.
It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
dead
File
easy
the
to do.
papers today. Yes.
Yeah. So that was the fleet plan, if you will.
But how real was, like, McBride? Okay, the way you're talking about it, it almost sounds like McBride and his buddy across the border were striking up some sort of gentleman's deal, and we're going to help something out. And
Mhm.
you were not casting any aspersions, and you were not trying to say that there was any evidence of any underhandedness or any payoffs or anything like that. So I'm presuming this was from the noblest intentions, and I'm being very serious here. But how close were we really to being defenseless in the Pacific, and how real was a German threat? They'd only had a navy of any significance for maybe 15, 20 years prior to that. So, like, how real do you think it was as a threat?
So it was a super real threat, and I'm being sort of comical a little bit, but not by intention. Premier McBride took a huge political chance, and he could have paid
Mhm.
the
Sure.
ultimate political price over this. And of course, being
Absolutely.
in Canada, no good decision goes by without being challenged. There was an inquiry into it, a public inquiry, to see whether he received kickbacks and all the
Yeah.
usual stuff.
Oh, of
Yeah. Yeah.
course.
Premier
Yeah.
McBride later knighted, so Sir McBride, um, absolutely clear. He received no personal benefit from this. He did it from the purest of intentions. There was some dispute over the date on the check and all this, like early conspiracy theories. That the check was actually dated on the 1st of August and the deal was concluded on the 4th of August. So there was a suspicion that, the deal had been pre-cooked and they'd used the war to.
Right.
Turns out that it was British government, or not British Columbia government practice at the time that all checks in the first part of the month, I forget to what date, were dated as the first. I don't know why they did this, but anyway, this is what they did. So yes, the check was written on the 4th, but it was predated to the 1st, and that's just what they did. So he was absolutely cleared. Patterson, let's be honest, he made some money out of this, and he
Oh,
got
he's a
rid of.
businessman.
Yeah, for sure. And making money is not an evil, right? It's expected that companies. I mean, the reason you take your shareholders' hard-earned money and you invest it into means of production is to make them
Mhm.
a profit. Otherwise, they could just leave it somewhere else, maybe a GIC or something, I guess. So yeah, no, he made a profit and he made a personal commission on it. There was some back and forth, and it's delineated very painfully in the commission. I think he asked for $70,000. He got 40, whatever. But
Mhm.
so he made some money. Sure, he got rid of two boats that were just sitting there, and boats sitting in the water. It's not like trying to think of a great example. If you have a truckload of bricks, you could just sort of park it in your yard and leave it there under a tarp, and it would be fine for 20 years.
Right.
Two submarines sitting alongside of the jetty, every day that goes by are in worse shape. Salt water is
Right.
not great for steel. So they're rusting away. The batteries, the lead acid has been mixed together, so the batteries are deteriorating. They normally have a very small shelf life, and they're very expensive. Like all of it, it's not good. You're going to pay people to go and blow the water out of the ballast tanks every day and that kind of stuff. So
Right.
got rid of these two boats that were sort of hanging around. It freed them from an entanglement with the Chilean government, which had been going on for several years. There was lawyers involved. I imagine that was costing them a fortune. So it was win-win for Miss Patterson to get rid of these two boats and to sell them and to have them in service. And notwithstanding that the Canadian Navy hadn't been actively looking for submarines, um, within a couple of weeks, they had names, they had command officers appointed, they had a support ship. HMCS Shearwater was their support ship, and they were on patrol. And as a submariner, I would say clearly they were doing what submarines do, and they deterred the German squadron from ever coming
Of
up
course.
shelling Victoria.
I have no recollection ever, and I've researched. I can't find any example of an attack on Victoria, Vancouver, or anywhere in British Columbia in World War I by Germans. So clearly, it was a result of the submarine service. We owe them a debt of gratitude.
Big one.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I also find really interesting is this was a case of a provincial government going out and buying submarines. So it wasn't a federal decision, it was a provincial decision. From your perspective as a submariner, uh, how significant was that moment? And what do you think McBride was trying to achieve by going out and securing these 2 submarines on his own?
So the premier clearly anticipated being reimbursed by the federal government. I suppose if we had email and stuff from back then and you did access information requests, there was probably a number of fairly urgent emails to the prime minister saying, "Hey, it's me again. The guy with the submarines."
Which total more than my annual budget.
So the submarines indeed were more than the entire Canadian Navy budget.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So and
the province of British Columbia
was reimbursed, and they got the money back. So Premier McBride, and I don't know a lot about him outside of this history. So if you're a British Columbia Premier history person, don't send me hate mail. And I would say from this, he did exactly what we want our elected leaders to do. He identified a problem. He found a course of action that would solve it. It was being held up by bureaucratic stuff, and he took action and he took a risk and he did it. So I think there's a lot of credit that goes to Premier McBride as certainly one of the parents of the Canadian Submarine Force. Good for him. And the German squadron, the East Asia squadron of the Imperial German Navy, had lifted anchor and could have been anywhere in the Pacific. Like, we know it was off the West Coast, and anyway, it ended up the first Canadian losses, the first Canadian service people killed in World War I were killed in a battle with that squadron off of Chile, in the Battle of Coronel. The top graduate of the Royal Navy College of Canada and the senior cadet captain and 2 other Canadian midshipmen lost their lives. And for any of your listeners that are, fans of alternate history and stuff, you could always debate what would happen to the Canadian Navy if our top graduate of our very first class of the Royal Navy College of Canada had not died in the Battle of Coronel. Like, who knows, right? The Canadian Navy would probably look different than it does today. And then, of course, that squadron. So the Germans were victorious over these 2 super old armored cruisers because the British fleet was protecting the home islands and not taking it really seriously. Up their game, sent a more capable squadron, and then the German squadron met its end off of the Falklands in December of 14.
Right.
All right. Before we get much further, Rejoy, this is a well-funded, very lucrative endeavor that we've got going on. So we have fantasy sponsors. Why don't you take us off with our first one?
Well, we do indeed. So before we dive beneath the waves, it's time for our Wish We Had a Sponsor segment. And today's episode is unofficially brought to you by a brand new fantasy sponsor of the show, the Premier's Private Reserve, the whiskey bold enough to buy 2 submarines without permission.
Distilled in secrecy, aged in plausible deniability, and bottled somewhere just outside Seattle.
You can taste the courage and the complete disregard for federal procurement policy.
The Premier's Private Reserve, Canada's finest fantasy whiskey. And remember, when you can't get approval, just get another round. All right, why don't you take us to the next question after that, there, Rejoy?
So let's talk about the drama of it all a little bit, and the secret deal. So the story sounds something like a little bit out of a spy novel. Midnight departures, secret payments, even torpedoes stolen in the dark. How much of that legend is true? And I guess what's really important for our financial-minded listeners to understand, how much did they spend?
So the whole story is true, the absolute truth and nothing but the truth. But in its retelling, of course, it seems more interesting and exciting than it probably really was. Um, so going into the shipyard and taking the boats out, the risk they were taking there is debatable. I don't know whether the Americans would open fire on them. I don't know if the Americans had
Oh,
guns
yes.
pointed at them
Right.
in the first place.
Right.
But without a doubt, it would have created an international incident. And the interconnectedness of all of Canada, but in particular the West Coast, where the waterways are shared, and the U.S. and Canada look at each other across the waterway. Everyone in Victoria can see the mountains in the U.S. when they wake up in the morning. It would have created um, war relationship between the West states and provinces for sure. It would have created some awkward questions. And at the time, the U.S. was really interested in maintaining this neutrality. And I would say, if you were to conduct a poll of the American citizenry at the time, it wasn't a clear, certain majority for the British and the French. It had only
A
been
lot of German-born Americans, weren't
a
there?
lot of German-born Americans. A lot of people, the whole assassination in Sarajevo and the drumbeat to war and the need to punish the Serb nationalists and all of that stuff. It wasn't a clear, hey, the French and the British and the Russians were on the path of goodness here. So it would have made it a much more difficult situation to smooth over that we had. Because, quite honestly, we knew that the embargo was going to be in place the next day. We had to get the boats out before the president signed the paperwork, which is really, like you knew the intent that he was going to sign the paperwork. So really, anyway. So it was a political risk. It was a financial risk. Certainly, Premier McBride, $35 million in today's money. You would have to account for that. And it's not for sure that people would have been in support of that. Because even in 1914, there was provincial federal draft. What is the province's responsibilities? What is the federal responsibility? Clearly, arming the Navy is a federal responsibility.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right.
So, there was a fair amount of drama there too. And then because of the nature of this, clearly there was always going to be an inquiry of some kind, as there was. And people would be asked to testify, and the inquiry would be made public, and all the deals would be exposed. So there was reputational risk for everyone involved. And I will say that inquiry absolutely exonerated all the people involved. Premier McBride looks great in it. And he was, to be fair, was not super embarrassed by what he'd done. He didn't appear to say, I'm sorry for what I did, proceeding with your permission. He was proud of what he did, and rightfully so.
Yeah. He took bold leadership.
Yeah.
Bold leadership.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you made a passing comment about how particularly one of the CC class subs had an alarming, I believe it was the term you used, tendency to dive straight for the bottom or straight for the top, which would, I guess, have the same results. But it's also the subs, and you also mentioned how quickly they got into service, which is super impressive. But the subs weren't even identical designs, were they?
They weren't.
And how big a problem would that have been for like training, supply, maintenance, and all that good stuff?
So it would have been a fairly big challenge. I mean, they were different enough. They were plus or minus the same design. One was a little bit longer than the other one. One had 2 more torpedo tubes than the other one. Which,
oh, really?
Yeah. So they kind of brushed it. I was rereading the inquiry last night just in preparation for this, and they're going, "Oh, well, yeah, okay, this was different, that was different, this sort of thing was different, but like they were the same. Nothing to see here." So, given the training at the time, everyone pretty much learned as they went along. It's very similar to the pilots and air warfare at the time. There was no rigorous qualification process. There's no certification, so you could swap people between CC1 and 2 pretty easily because they really didn't know what they were doing super well on either boat, so it was all good. But they're built by the same shipyard, the same technology, plus or minus. So the boats were different. But they were close enough that you could operate. And people sailed on CC1 or CC2. CC2 was the one that had the tendency to go down, and a little bit of water coming in. So it had this reputation as being, a boat that everyone wanted to avoid. And the commission looks into this in fairly big detail. Turns out that was just a myth. They interviewed the crews, the chief engineers, the captains, crew members, etc. And like they used the boats interchangeably. No one had a bigger concern for their life going on CC2 versus CC1. So it worked out okay.
You can see that it's a true submariner that can say that a little bit of water coming in. So, you get water when you open the tap as well. It's fine.
Exactly.
And like,
How bad can it be?
and they're interchangeable.
Yeah.
Like with the C6 and the C7, they're both C's, triggers,
These were small boats. And, to paint the picture a little bit, there would have been a fair amount of claustrophobia in them. It's kind of like being in a houseboat, but if you put 30 people in a houseboat. So there was 9 people on watch at any given time. So they rotated their watches. They went out on 2-week patrols. So we'd go out for 2 weeks, in for 2 weeks, do maintenance, charge batteries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it would have been a dark and uncomfortable place. There was clearly no showers or any of that kind of stuff on board. Kitchen facilities were lightweight camping level kitchen facilities. Like it wouldn't have been a super comfortable place, but they really believed in their mission, particularly in that first 4 or 5 months, deterring the German cruisers squadron under von Spee. And it was important work. Interestingly, at the start of the war in Schweinmal, the most capable warships in the area were Imperial Japanese ships. And they participated. They joined the war. I'm going to say about 2 weeks after Canada, 2-3 weeks. Don't quote me on that. But joined the war on the Allied side. Also took part in patrols, sovereignty patrols, protecting the West Coast from the marauding German fleet. So we had Japan on our side, and not yet the Americans. So it was kind of an interesting twist, right? When you see what happened a mere 25-ish years later.
That is very interesting, isn't it? Given what's happened since then. And when you talked a lot about the state of those 2 early submarines, got overheating engines, ballast issues, that tendency of one of them to dive unexpectedly. But how dangerous would you say it was serving aboard these early boats in comparison to today's boats?
So significantly more dangerous, I would say. Today's boats, particularly following the loss of the USS Thresher, which was a nuclear submarine off the east coast of the United States in the 60s. It was out on billiards trials, and had a mechanical defect and ended up being lost with all hands. That led to a program called SubSafe, which is a material certification program, which involves training and certifications and team training stuff. But it's at its heart a material certification regime, which has been replicated in many of the Western navies. So Canadian submarines today also have a SubSafe program. We track every piece of equipment. We track who did the work, what their certifications were, what the quality assurance documents were, what the testing was, training of the crew, the workups of the crew. All of that is tracked to be sure that when we send a submarine to sea, that it, is a very safe place to be, given the extremes of the environment that it's working in. Back then, submarines were routinely lost through mechanical defect or through error.
Oh, really?
That continued probably until about 1970-ish in the fleets of the world. And a whole bunch of submarines were lost. So it was a very dangerous thing to do, particularly operating in a place that wasn't used to submarines. So if you're driving a merchant ship up the Strait of Juan de Fuca and you're heading into Seattle or Vancouver, you're not expecting to keep clear of a small platform you can barely see, particularly if it's at depth. You're only seeing the periscope occasionally. So one of the bigger risks that they faced was just being run down by a merchant ship that was unaware of them and that they were unaware of. In those early patrols, the boat would go out as they were sort of learning to be submariners. And in 1914, submarines were surface boats that operated submerged, as opposed to today where submarines go out, they dive, and they spend all their time underwater. So they would operate in a condition called trim down. So they'd have as much water in the ballast tanks as they could without actually being all the way under the water. And the idea there was twofold. One, it lowered the silhouettes so they were harder to spot. But two, if they needed to dive, they could do it very quickly because they're already like half dived. And then when they would spot a ship, they would dive and approach. have a look and deter it. So if you get hit in that sort of trimmed down condition, the submarine's going to die very quickly. So it was risky. And they were learning as they went, right? The mission of submarines up to that point, as they were sort of coming online in the navies of the world, was to screen for the battle fleet. So you went out, you protected the fleet
Right.
against destroyers and other submarines and cruisers. This whole indications and warning, deterrence patrol stuff, which is bread and butter of what submarines do today, wasn't really a thing back then. So they, in addition to learning to operate the boats, they were learning how to employ the boats as well. So yeah, pretty impressive.
And yet the CC class never actually fired a torpedo in anger. But there's a lot of historians who will say that they prevented an attack simply just by existing. So could you talk about the power of deterrence in submarine strategy then and now?
Yeah, so kind of the idea of a submarine is, because it's underwater and hard to detect, submarine can be anywhere and you don't know. So you have to
Right.
treat everywhere as if there's a submarine there.
Yeah.
So if you were operating the German cruiser squadron, you would have to take as, for a given, I should say, that somewhere plus or minus a couple of 100 miles of Victoria are two submarines. And at the time, a cruiser was pretty indefensible, I guess. Early in World War One, a German U-boat had sunk a couple of cruisers, British cruisers, and sort of taught the navies of the world a lesson that these are much more capable than people thought they were. They were sort of considered an adjunct at the time, and something where,
Because cruisers were relatively thin-sided, weren't they? Am I correct in
yeah.
that?
So depending on
To go faster?
depending on the era of the cruiser. And the
Mhm.
naval arms race, which is, I personally find a fascinating time, but say from about 1870 through to the start of World War One, cruisers were developed, concepts were developed, designs were made, ships were built, and they were no sooner coming off the production line than the concept changed. They were obsolete overnight,
Oh,
and out they went.
Yeah.
So the armored cruisers that were sunk off of during the Battle of Cornwall were probably about 15, 20-year-old ships. I don't remember off the top of my head. And they were hopelessly obsolete. And they
Right.
were vanquished in battle with a entire loss of life, both ships company, by a squadron of ships that were maybe 10 years newer, but enough newer
Wow.
that it just rapidly changed it. So to answer your question more specifically, depending on the generation of the cruiser, they had sort of vacillated between heavily armed, heavily gunned, slower, lightly armed, heavily gunned, faster, lightly armed, lightly gunned, even faster, longer range, right? It depends on the era.
right.
But a torpedo doesn't discriminate. A heavily armed or a lightly armed ship is equivalent to a torpedo. They sink them both pretty effectively.
So,
Wow.
considering that it was a brand new field and they were learning as they went along, what kinds of patrols would they have actually carried out during that time? And what would a typical day at sea have looked like for those crews?
Yeah, so generally the crew would have consisted of people standing watches.
Mhm.
Nine at a time would stand watch. So you would have someone like an officer watch, someone in charge, a team leader, if you will, looking out of the periscope or standing on the bridge, doing a lookout and directing the activities. With them, you would have had, if they were on the bridge, they would have had a lookout with them, probably someone with a small arm of some kind and a pair of binoculars, sort of controlling things and looking around. And then down inside the submarine or in the control room, the engine room, you would have had people running the diesel engines, and they primarily operated on their diesel. Battery technology in 1914 um, left a lot to be
Limited.
desired. So
Yeah.
they have a long range on their batteries, a couple of miles type of thing. So kind of
Oh, yeah.
an hour or two, depending on your speed that you're operating. So they ran on their diesels all the time. So
Like the
diesels,
original iPhone.
yeah, the diesels of the era, probably 3 or 4 people per diesel, 2 diesels,
Uh,
on watch at any given time. So 6 or 8 people working back there. And then there would be other people who would be just doing general husbandry type things on board, making food, pumping water overboard, fixing things that are broken, and sleeping.
so relatively mundane.
Yeah,
Anyways.
yeah.
Would it have been hot, cold, wet, dry?
All of those, and
Yeah.
often at the
Wet,
same
wet in
time.
one particular submarine. So,
So
Yeah.
Pac Northwest, even um, in nice conditions in the Pacific Northwest, it's still cold. It's still
Yeah,
wet,
yeah,
miserable. But the diesel engines running make it nice and hot, like
right.
uncomfortably hot. You would probably be experiencing 35 C temperatures most of the time, except when you were
Ooh.
outside on the bridge, and then you'd be freezing. So it'd be that nice balance to sort of twist things off. But
The average was lovely.
yeah, for sure.
Yes.
And it hasn't changed, by the way. So those 9 people on watch would have 9 people off watch, who would just spend, say, 6 hours on watch and were trying to sleep and catch up on stuff. So that's 18 people. And then the other 10 or 12 people would be going around fixing things and making sure
So you're trying to sleep, given they turn the engines off so you could sleep, right? They wouldn't want those noisy
and
engines.
they would park.
Yeah, obviously.
They would just, find a parking spot, double park it for a while. So long
doubt.
periods of mundane um, patrol, followed by occasional moments of excitement. If there was a fire or a flood or the boat randomly decided to point at the bottom or whatever, and then you overcome that, and then you go back on with patrol. So those 2 weeks would have passed by in a heartbeat, and also seemed like the longest 2 weeks of their lives at all.
Right, right. In many ways, there are similarities with the infantry, aren't there? I mean,
Very similar.
moments of
As you see
boredom,
the Ford
punctured by
OP or something, wondering about the
yeah,
life choices that led you there.
yeah.
It's very similar.
That's a whole episode on its own. So,
No therapy. We're not talking about therapy.
oh yeah, steer away from that. So, as today's senior submariner in the Royal Canadian Navy, do you see echoes of that same kind of make do spirit in our present Navy, in the present arm of the
Yeah, for
submarine
sure.
service?
And a historical interest is, I'm going to say, generally the purview of older people. I'm just going to put that at
Yeah.
would be entirely
What are
wrong.
you trying to say? Would you like
but-
to see the demographics of our audience profile?
So, when I was a young submariner, I plus or minus knew the history of the Canadian submarine force because you had to, because you were taught it and tested on it in the certification process to become a submariner. But I wouldn't say that I was deeply, deeply interested in it. But as I went on, I became more interested in it. And as I moved through the ranks, things that interested me, fascinated people that work with me. So we've named a couple of buildings. Barney Johnson, who was one of our very first captains, we named the maintenance facility out west for him. We've named a torpedo training facility in Halifax as well. We've named a building on the West Coast. Like, we've done a number of things, and we've tried to do events on the 5th of August, which, for those keeping up, was the day that the boats arrived just south of Trail Island and were inducted into service. But notwithstanding a mediocre interest in our historical past, I would say, by most people, the spirit of can-do, the spirit of making do with submarine that is what we have, perhaps not what we would deeply desire, had sort of permeated throughout the Canadian submarine history, which goes back to 1914. After World War I was had shifted more to a trench stalemate and battles of larger fleets outside of Europe, the CC1 and 2 ended up in Halifax. They survived the Halifax explosion of 1917. By survived, I mean they didn't sink. They were completely trashed at that point. And they were replaced after World War I by 2 H model boats, CH-14 and 15, which in the peace dividend of the very early 1920s were disposed of. And then we didn't really operate. We had submariners mostly operating in British boats, or almost exclusively in British boats, through until the very early 1960s, when we bought the 3 Oberon class submarines, which weren't our dream submarines then either. We'd flirted plus or minus with bi-nuclear submarines. The price was enormous. So then we were going to buy a class of submarines. The last American diesel electric submarines got the Barbowl class. And that's what we wanted. That was our heart's desire in the time in 1960. They were twice the cost of Oberons. So we got the Oberons.
Oh, bronze it is. Oh,
and
bronze
we only
it
got
is.
3. And happily, and keeping in theme, the 3 were not the same as each other. They
So custom and tradition
That's
continues.
current tradition, right? And they really were, to have a viable, sustainable submarine fleet, you need generally at least 6, right? Because you have a boat is in a deep refit at all times. You have a boat going into refit, a boat coming out of refit, and then that leaves you a boat to be able to do something with. So if you want to have 2 boats to do something with, you need like 8. So 3 was a stopgap. Submarines post World War II, and based a lot on our experiences in World War II of defeating the U-boat menace, which Churchill said was the only thing that kept him awake at night. Which I think in prime Churchill ways, that was exaggeration, as many of his quotes are. I'm sure there were other things, like I'm thinking he had a hard time sleeping on the 5th of June, 1944, but maybe not. But the U-boat menace came really close to strangling the Allied war effort, and particularly the UK. So there was a big interest in having live submarines for training. And really, between 1939 and 1943, plus or minus, when we got a handle on defeating the U-boat menace, the thing that had made the difference was training teams of ships to fight together. And the way you train them to fight together was to have submarines for them to fight, simulated fight, and to learn to do it. So that was the prime interest in having a submarine force in Canada at the time. We had an aircraft carrier, we had a couple of cruisers coming out of the war. Like it was the dream of a big navy, and a complete navy included submarines. So the 3 O-boats were bought plus or minus to keep that capability going. We'd had a long-term lease agreement. The Royal Navy, the British Navy, had operated a squadron of A-class submarines at Halifax from the 50s to the early 60s, and then the O-boats replaced them for this role. On the West Coast, we had we leased the first one and bought the second one, a couple of fleet boats, and operated American boats on the West Coast. But yeah, going back to the original question and meandered a bit there, but the same spirit of can-do, of making what we have work, is common throughout history. And I would say, for any of the Army listeners out there, just say LSVW and just sort of park that as a unexplained statement.
Won't touch that one here, but we are going to take a little break for a fantasy sponsor. This episode is also unofficially supported by yet another completely fictitious sponsor, Torpedo Gin, best served below sea level.
Indeed, handcrafted in small batches, just like the early Canadian submarine program, unstable, underfunded, and somehow still afloat.
Perfect for those moments when you need a stiff drink, but can't quite surface yet.
Pairs beautifully with stale rations, battery fumes, and the faint hum of an overheating diesel engine.
Torpedo Gin, because sometimes even a depth charge deserves a twist of lime. Chris, these boats that you've been talking about, you come up. I mean, you've got a lot of experience at sea, and I think your risk tolerance is probably a little higher than Rejoy and I, who we'd like to point out became experts on submarines last November when we visited Philadelphia and did a tour of the Bakuna. So I think probably honorary submariners just from that. We spent a good 45 minutes in there.
We should get a free cap or something, no? So.
But one of the things that really struck me when you were talking to me before about is like how not makeshift, that's not quite the right way to say it, but how I guess basic the conditions were and how basic the machinery was. So the fact that they were taking them out on 2-week patrols is one thing, but then they decided to steam them, I believe, from the West Coast over to the East Coast. So that 1917 voyage, when they decided to take them out there from Esquimalt to Halifax, it's often been described as an odyssey. It's a long trip, and presuming I would have presumed they steamed mostly on the surface, but you're saying they probably would not have. They would have been mostly.
No, they would have been on the surface for sure.
They would have been on the surface. But okay. So what does that journey reveal about the endurance and the professionalism of those sailors on the early Canadian submarines?
I think it would show the power of optimism. They both believed they could do it, and they could in fact do it. But it was touch and go, right? And so they did the journey in a number of hops, and you would do that today as well, just for fuel stops and that stuff. But every time they made it to port, the engineering crews in particular would have been closed up, fixing everything that had broken and keeping those
Oh
boats
wow.
going. It was not a sure thing that those boats were going to make it. Which, in a
Wow.
weird and off-topic way, when we bought the two American fleet boats, one of them came around from Norfolk, and the fleet boat had 4 engines on it. And the oral history of the veterans that are still alive, so that they'd be in their 80s and 90s now, is that it arrived in the Strait of Juan de Fuca on either one engine or no engines, depending on on who's telling the story and how much of that fictitious torpedo gin they drunk. But so yeah, plus Sachas, plus them shows. So yeah, it was, and I had said earlier, like these are small, not
Yeah.
sophisticated craft, certainly not intended for transoceanic voyages of any
Right.
kind. And that trip, I've done that trip from Halifax to Squamish a couple of times, and it's long. And if you have no appreciation for how big Mexico is, try steaming side of Mexico for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and it's a huge country.
And it was the submarines. They were the first Canadian warships to pass through the Panama Canal, weren't they?
They were, but yeah, okay, but the Panama Canal hadn't existed for such a long time either, right?
Hey man, first
That
first is
said it
the
all.
first is first at all counts. No one remembers second place. The RMR was the first regiment in British Empire history to receive its colors on foreign conquered soil.
That's
Now,
right.
10 other units did the same afternoon, but we were the fucking first.
Yes.
No one else talks about it, but we do.
Well, we talk about it. We
Yeah.
talk about it every chance we get right
Yeah.
now.
So,
But that's a
reading
huge
some of these
milestone,
accounts
isn't it?
that Chris, you talked about, like chlorine gas leaks, fires, breakdowns.
Yeah.
Do you think those men? You mentioned optimism. Do you think they realized how historic their trip would become?
No, I would imagine that they were similar to today's submariners. They just had their head down. They were focused on the task at hand, and they were just pushing on to get it done.
Right.
Yeah, they would not have lacked for things to do to keep themselves occupied and thinking about. Like, it's a remarkable voyage, and for any car fans or whatever, it'd be like taking probably a 30 or 40-year-old Range Rover and trying to drive across the Sahara in it or something like that, where you need a lot of
Right.
tools, a lot of spare parts, a backup team. They went around with a support ship, Shearwater went with them, because that's how ships and submarines operated back then. A submarine, despite doing 2-week patrols, they were not independent assets, right? They couldn't do their own deep maintenance.
Oh,
They didn't
I
carry
see.
their spare parts on board, or most of the spare parts, because there's no room. They certainly didn't carry enough fuel to make it. So they were more analogous to airplanes and ships. Ship
interesting.
could go a lot longer. Although, if for fun, if you want to Google coaling ports around the world, you
Okay.
will see that the Royal Navy, back in the age of coal, had established these outposts everywhere. That's roughly the range of a cruiser in between
Yeah.
them, and that was
Yeah.
that then became where wireless stations were set up, and it became where navy
Right.
bases, and like sustainment and logistics plays a much larger role in all military operations than I think we probably talk about.
I think I read a short account where Churchill was talking about those early days in 1914 and the chasing of the two German cruisers. It was the Breslau and the other one, the name escapes me, but how the Royal Navy squadrons would always stop for coaling, and they'd have a coaler come out and refuel the ships, and then they'd carry on in the search. So yeah, to your point, it is quite amazing. People forget that there was a whole network that was involved in the supply and the logistics, regardless of the time and the era. So the CC boats, they ended their days as training hulks, didn't they, in the Bras d'Or Lake? But this is where your lineage comes from, really, isn't it? Um,
Yeah.
so do you think they still matter?
CC 1 and 2?
Yep.
Absolutely. It really was the step towards a professional navy, a navy that covered
Mm-hmm.
sort of multi-domain and was multi-purpose in use. Up until that point, the navy was struggling to survive. World War I came along,
Mm.
slightly over 4 years after the Navy was created.
Hmm.
And we had gone from no Navy at all. We had a fisheries protected squadron, from no Navy at all to having 2 large ships. By memory, and someone will correct me because I'll clearly be wrong here, but Niobe was 11,000-ish tons. So a Halifax class frigate today is less than half of that, and the Halifax class
Oh, wow.
pretty big ship. So these were large, difficult to operate ships that we were learning to operate, and we went from that to a capable escort force, operated submarines, and became the Navy of today. So I would say they have a large and super important role in the history of the Canadian Navy.
I'm going to skip that next question because I think you just answered it, Rejo. Why don't you take the question after that?
Yeah, so if you could take the crews of CC-1 and CC-2 aboard one of today's Victoria-class submarines, what do you think would astonish them the most?
I would say that it would be the creature comforts.
Right. Okay.
So a boat
Yeah.
of 1914 era, everything is on display. Every pipe, valve, connection, you name it, is on display. Whereas today there is some false bulkheads and stuff, and like a lot of it's on display, but they're more akin to being like RVs or trailers or something like that than they are to living in the engine room of a submarine, which is what it was like back then. Yeah. So I think
So far more
creature
comfortable.
comforts. Now you tell that to a Canadian submariner today, and they would. What are you talking about? No, like I get it. But compared to CC-1 and 2, we've evolved a little bit. But they would recognize things as being the same. When I was a very young officer on the O-boat in the East Coast, we had a German World War II submariner come on board as a guest, and we're showing him around. And even though it at that point had been probably 50 years since he'd last been on a submarine, he recognized, he could identify equipment, he could even start some of this equipment because it, like an LP, a low pressure blower is a low pressure blower, like the technology.
Yeah.
And he could tell by the hull spacing of the the frames, roughly what the diving depth of the boat was. We of course did not confirm or deny it, but like it was pretty close off. Because a submarine is.
Who wants to know, old man?
So battery technology has changed a lot, and we're of an age that we remember those original brick phones and the Nokias and all that stuff. And you remember what battery range on a phone was 25 years ago? Like you charged it twice a day, whereas now an iPhone, probably with moderate usage, will go a day and a half. So that technology has changed a lot. Although a Victoria class had a lead acid battery, which is the exact same technology as CC-1 and 2 had. Our batteries are more capable. We understand more about batteries, so we're able to make them go further. But the technology, while the same, is much more evolved, to the point that maintaining the breathable atmosphere on board and all that kind of stuff is much easier to do now than it was back then.
Finally, Admiral, when Canadians think about standing on guard for thee, what should they remember about the sailors who did it from beneath the waves?
I think they should remember their spirit of can-do. Their really Canadian spirit of making do. Canadians, particularly Canadian service people, generally don't have the best equipment, Ross rifle or whatever. But they become
a great weapon.
They're ferocious at making things work and achieving the aim. And the sailors on CC-1 and 2 achieved that as well.
Admiral Robinson, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time and really enjoyed doing this episode with you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, I'm good. I appreciate you guys having me on board.
Well, thank you folks for listening. Please like and subscribe and share this episode with a friend or two. And as always, cheers to history.